Well, good day to everyone joining us and welcome to today's X-Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Scaling Up eConsent in Traditional and Decentralized Clinical Trials. My name is Edward and I'll be your X-Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes. This presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. This webinar is designed to be interactive, so please feel free to ask questions anytime during the live Q&A session, and our speakers will answer anytime. You can do so by messaging us in the chat box. This chat box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, you can message me via this chat panel that's found on the right-hand side of your screen. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available for future streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Signant Health, who developed the content for today's presentation. Signant Health is the evidence generation company. They are focused on leveraging software, deep therapeutic and scientific knowledge, and operational expertise to consistently generate quality evidence for clinical studies across traditional, virtual, and hybrid trial models. For more than 20 years, over 400 sponsors and CROs of all sizes, including all of top 20 pharma, have trusted Signant Health solutions for remote and site-based eCOA, eConsent, RTSM, supply chain management, and data quality analytics. To learn more, please visit www.signanthealth.com. And I'd like to pass at this point the mic over to Dr. Bill Byram, who will be introducing our speakers today. Before I do so, I just want to also note that for those of you that attended live, Signant Health has offered handouts for today's webinar. So you're more than welcome to download those handouts at your leisure. They can be found on the bottom right side under the handouts section in the control panel. With that, I'll go ahead and pass it over to you, Bill.
Great, thank you, Edward. So I'm Bill Byram. I'm a principal of EcoScience at Signant Health. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you here to our webinar today. So yes, it's down to me really just to introduce today's panel of speakers. First, we're joined by Edwin Cohen from AstraZeneca, where Edwin's part of the R&D Digital Patient Health and Innovation Organization within AZ. And this group focuses on adopting digital tools and initiatives to improve patient outcomes by providing new medicines and complementary therapeutics to the right patient faster. As part of this, one of Edwin's responsibilities is the global implementation of eConsent, and we're looking forward to hearing more about the pioneering work that AZ are doing a little bit later. We're also joined by Mika Lindroos, who's the Director of Product Management, responsible for our eConsent product here at Signant Health. And last but not least, Ryan Bowe, who's Signant Health's Regulatory Compliance Head. So Ryan also serves as a contributing member of the eClinical Forum's Regulatory Expert Group. So welcome panelists. And if you go to the next slide, please, Edward. So just briefly, our agenda for today, Edwin will kick off and really provide some ground setting by providing an overview of the processes involved in consent form development and implementation. And that applies whether you're using a paper process or going electronic. Mika will then speak about solution features that enable effective scale up of eConsent. And then Ryan was going to talk about the global regulatory environment and how to successfully navigate this when scaling up eConsent. And then finally, Edwin will come back and conclude by speaking about how AstraZeneca are looking at applying eConsent across their organization. And as Edward mentioned, please do ask questions throughout the presentations using that chat box. And where time permits, we'll address one or two of those at the end of each of those segments of this presentation, as well as bring them all together at the end for a question and answer session towards the end. So it's with great pleasure to invite Edwin from AstraZeneca to provide this overview of the consent form documentation process. Over to you, Edwin.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks for the introduction and inviting me for this session. So Yes, the last bit of this presentation will be to give you a little bit of insight on our learnings, considerations when looking into scaling eConsent. But before I do that, I would like to take a deeper dive into sort of the consenting process itself, because it's relevant to the decisions that you're going to make in the future. And I would like to start with giving a bit more insight on the end-to-end process itself, purely because looking at the audience, we have people who have experience with either the end part of the consenting process on an implementation on a site level, but we also have got people who are acting and working on the global part of the organizations, and that's just, I would say, a small piece of this process. And I always start with stating that in my belief, the informed consent, the document and its process, is probably one of the most complex documents and processes that we have within the clinical operation landscape. It's still highly paper-based. The feedback that we still get from patient advocacy groups and even IRBs and ethical committees is that it's too lengthy, too technical written, and complex. And during audit and inspections, it always comes up as a finding. So to give a little bit of insight and do that step back and show you the full end-to-end process, what I've done is I've broken down that process into 3 different components. So I've got the first part, the development of the document itself. Once it all has been developed, then we need to implement this. And implementing means that site and site staff need to work with this together with their patients and start that consenting process. And eventually, once the document has been signed, we need to do something with the document and the associated information that we capture either in this document itself and where it's being linked to any other study-specific procedures that we do. So going a little bit back to the development, obviously the development of an informed consent is driven by our regulations. ICH, GCP are the fundamentals for this document. And we need to start developing this document first on a global level, and then we need to, once that's final, need to either translate it or modify this to a local level. And this is a continuous process that will need to be followed for each individual study. Once you have localized your documents, then it's ready for submission and approval, where our regulatory bodies, IRBs, central ethics committees, depending on where you are located, will review these documents. Once then approved, we can start using the document, and then it's up to the site staff who need to follow, also in line with ICH GCP, follow the informed consent process. And as an end result, if a patient has read and understood everything, they will sign up the document together with the site staff. And then all the other study-specific assessments will start. The last thing is about filing, not only filing the signed document on site, but also maintaining and capturing the information that is related to the informed consent, all the optional, the options that they can sign on the consent form itself, and in which systems do we capture this type of information. So what I've mentioned here as well is that this principle and this process for developing and implementing the consent is not only applicable to the current paper process, but when going for eConsent, we will need to keep these steps into account as it will affect them. The last thing to close with, I would say, is that, and what makes it even more complex, is that these process steps, including the development, the approval, and the implementation, will need to be followed for each individual consenting document that is being created for each individual study. And we know, and we've seen so many times, that 4, 5 different types of ICFs have been developed from the start. They are not always being used, but more even complex is when we encounter ICF amendments, which will be seen like on an annual basis for a study, and especially if you look at long studies. So even with an ICF amendment, we need to start from the beginning again and move to the right in this case. So I hope with this sort of basic information, you've got a little bit more clarity on the full scope of the informed consent process. And during my learnings and considerations, I will feed back to this simple activity here. And then I will pass to you, Bill, because I think we're going to do a short poll here as well.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Edwin. And yeah, maybe just ask you a quick question just as we bring up the poll, because we do want to ask the audience a question. But in terms of that process of developing those paper ICFs and starting with that global one, going down to the different versions, how much reuse is it possible to implement in this process, with it being fairly manual and perhaps not very digitized? If there are standard sections and standard bits of content that you want your teams to reuse time and time again, is that an easy thing to implement or not so?
No, I'm afraid not. I think there is a lot of dependencies when you look at internally. So the global document that is being developed, well, at least in AstraZeneca, but I've worked for a couple of different sponsors. The stakeholders involved in the development of a document, it's a large group, and there are a lot of dependencies, like a protocol, like an IAB, and those parts, data privacy is another one, legal, that all need to flow into these documents. And because so many people are involved and there's differences between the different studies, it's a challenge to reuse the developed either content and the documents. That doesn't mean that it's not possible. There are definitely ways to do that.
All right. Well, thank you both. With that, I'll go ahead and lead off to our first poll question of the day, and I'll launch that on everybody's screen. You can vote on these polls in real time, so we do encourage everyone to do so if they have an answer option that is applicable to them. And today's first poll question asks, what is your personal hands-on experience of implementing the consenting process, whether it be paper or electronic? And the answer options we have here are global ICF development, localization of the global ICF, site implementation of the consent process. Is it all of the above, or is it none of them? Do you have little direct hands-on experience with the consenting process? I'll give the audience a few more seconds to cast their votes. Again, audience members can interact with this poll live right now by clicking any one of the answer options available. This poll asking, what is your personal hands-on experience of implementing the consenting process, paper or electronic? And again, the answer options being global ICF development, localization of the global ICF, site implementation of the consent process. Is it all of the above? Or do you have no or little direct hands-on experience of implementing the consenting process? It looks like most of our audience members have voted here. I'll give everyone just a few final seconds. All right, great. Well, thank you all for voting, and let's go ahead and have a look at the results. All right, Bill. Well, it would appear that 31% of our audience voted that they have experience with all of the above, and a tie there, another 31% of the audience voting that they had no to little direct hands-on experience, 18% voting site implementation of the consent process, 11% voting global ICF development, and 8% voting that they have experience with their personal experiences with localization of the global ICF. Again, thanks so much for the audience for voting. And Bill, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, that's great, and it's perhaps we have quite an experienced audience. I think maybe not a surprise. We have quite a few clinical operations people attending today, and it's a big part of the role for a lot of those people is to have some involvement in the consenting process. So Yeah, really good to see. So yeah, keen to see the kind of the questions from such an experienced audience as we progress with the presentation. So and I think just thanks again to Edwin. That was a really super overview of the process. It really helps to kind of ground the conversation. And nice to pass over now to Mika, because Mika, I guess you're going to talk now a little bit about how we digitize that process and the kind of things to look for in solutions as we scale up with eConsent. So if I could pass over to Mika now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just before we do that, Mika did have another poll question for our audience here that he'd like to ask. So if I may, I'm going to ask this poll question really quickly. So again, this is another poll question that we'd like to ask our audience about. And you can answer using one of the answer options available here. So it is a live poll. How would you describe your organization's experience in implementing eConsent? And the answer options that we have here is your organization is currently exploring the topic, but not implementing it as of yet. They are piloting eConsent. They have limited use of eConsent in one or more therapeutic areas. They are scaling up eConsent across their organization, or is it currently systematic use? Again, our audience can vote on this poll in real time. I'll give, of course, you all a few seconds to cast your votes there. How would you describe your organization's experience in implementing eConsent? Alrighty, it looks like most of you have voted here. And with that, I'll go ahead and close the poll, and I'll be happy to share the results with all of you here. Okay, so it looks like 28%, the most of our audience here describe that their organization's experience is with exploring the topic but not implementing it as of yet. 25% voting that they are scaling up to eConsent across their organization. Another 25% voted that they have limited use of eConsent in one or more therapeutic areas. And 23% voting that they are piloting eConsent, with 0% voting that they had systematic use. So it looks like we almost have a four-way tie over here. Again, very interesting results. Bill, did you have any quick thoughts on this before I pass it over to Mika?
Yeah, I think it just illustrates perhaps the timeliness of this topic. You know, we don't have any organizations using this at scale systematically at this point, but we have a lot of interest. You know, 3/4 are either piloting or using it in some areas or beginning to scale up. So a timely topic and a great topic to pass over to Mika.
Absolutely, absolutely. And with that, I'll go ahead and pass the control over to you, Mika.
All right, thanks, Bill. Thanks, Edward. I'm not seeing the control request.
Pardon me. Let me go ahead and try and send that over to you again.
Thanks.
We can see your webcam, so that's perfect. And I am sending you control one more time here.
Yes, now I can see it.
Excellent. Thank you.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Edward. Thanks, Bill. So yeah, Bill, like you said, there clearly seems to be room to scale up. So let's discuss that a bit here for next 10 minutes or so. What I have here is an overview of the key items, or you could say key domains that are contributing to the scaling up of eConsent. So I'll briefly introduce them here. They're flowing from high level to detail level implementation, and I'm then going to walk them through in the slides following this one. And like Bill said in the beginning, I'm talking from the product and solution point of view. Edwin is going to then touch upon the kind of other aspects later on in the presentation. So on the top there, I have service level options, and what I mean by that is that Sometimes you have studies that have simple ICF forms. Sometimes the studies are quite complex and require in-depth understanding in order to join the study. And therefore, it's kind of important that you're able to adapt to that need so that you can actually have a different service level options available to match other simple or more complex designs of the ICFs. So what we have learned is over the time that one size fits all approach just doesn't work. So that's why it's relevant. And then moving on to the support for flexible study design. So typically, depending on the therapeutic area, you have different study populations, different signature option needs, and you might be running in a decentralized trial, or you might be running in face-to-face trial. So you need to have flexibility and configurability available for you in order to scale up efficiently the eConsent use. Then moving to the choice of the delivery model, and that's more about how do you actually build the consent form. Are you doing it yourself, or are you outsourcing the work? If you need to, balance any peaks in the demand and things like that. So again, here having those different delivery options available helps you selecting the right one and scaling up the eConsent use. And then finally, in the workflow, you need to have functionalities which help you kind of speeding up the delivery, and there's a kind of a lot of repetitive work in the consent development. So how can you actually automate that and use templates? I will talk a bit more about those going forward. So what are those functionalities? So I'll take you through these one by one in a bit more detail. So first of all, the service level options. And like I said, one size does not fit all. So your study types, your study needs and situations, they vary. So sometimes you have very simple forms, sometimes you have complex forms. Sometimes you might be in a hurry, and sometimes you're well prepared and you have time to set up. Or your budget might be on the low side, or you might have adequate budget available to you. Again, it could be that your ICF forms are ready and approved, or you're just developing them. Or you might be looking for like standalone experience for eConsent, or then on the other hand, integrating with the rest of the eClinical ecosystem with the EDCs and IRT, IVR systems out there, lab management systems. So sometimes you just have the situation where you need a simple solution to move quickly forward. You have a simple form, and all you need really is the signature. But then again, you have these situations where the study is really complex, and you need maybe rich multimedia to really make sure that the participant experience and participant understanding of the content is really kind of well outlined and explained to the participant. So in order to kind of balance between these two types of approach, you need a solution which can support the both approach, because this also then helps you invest your time and invest your money between the simpler and more complex studies, and allowing you to spend less for simpler and more on the more complex studies. And all of this is then contributing on organizational level to scaling up the eConsent use. Moving on to the study design. So depending on the kind of therapeutic area you're working at, you might have a pediatric study where you have assent documents, or you might have emergency situations where the patient is unconscious when they are enrolling to the study, and then later on, signing the consent forms themselves. So you might have different cohorts, people with diabetes, heart condition, whatever, that you need to kind of address their needs with specific consent forms. And even for the standard, like more standard setup, you probably need to support LAR or impartial witness and different kind of signature configurations. So there's a kind of lot of variation how the studies are set up. Also, global regulations when it comes to signatures, for example, us needing to sign on paper, or in some countries you allow electronic signatures. In somewhere you need advanced electronic signatures. So how do you deal with those? Sometimes the ethics committees have requirements on the document layout or specific language that needs to be included. Sometimes they have specific requirements for language that doesn't or can't be included into the consent forms. And also your study can be a decentralized trial, it can be a remote, a hybrid trial between remote and face-to-face use. So basically you need to balance between all of these different settings. And in order to scale up efficiently, you need to have the capability to configure the study design accordingly. So this requires high configurability, and really configurability is the word you should be looking at and thinking about when you're considering study designs and scaling up the eConsent use from one type of a study to another. Then I had the delivery models as a third thing to consider, and here basically it's really about shall I do it myself or shall I outsource the eConsent development? And if you already have your own team that is currently working on the paper consent forms, then the eConsent forms themselves are not that complex. So Edwin mentioned the process is complex, and that is true, but the forms themselves are relatively straightforward, and especially within a study, they repeat themselves a lot. So therefore, if you have people who used to working with consent forms and using, for example, Microsoft Word, it's not that different thing for them to for example, develop the consent forms in an electronic environment. And if you have that team, then they can take a lot of that development pressure. They can bring out the eConsent, and if you have high demand, then maybe outsource it where it makes sense. So again, here balancing between developing the consent form by yourself or outsourcing, it's good to have both options available, so that helps you scaling up the eConsent. And then finally, the the workflow support. So this is basically the bits and pieces that help you delivering faster. And a few things that you want to make sure that you have available. So first of all, ICF templates, they are a key thing for reusing your existing work. So if you already have rolled out eConsent, you develop something, you can save it as templates and then roll it out in your following studies. Also having powerful import capabilities. So whether you're doing an interactive consent or non-interactive eConsent, you should be able to leverage your existing paper documents and jumpstart the eConsent development by importing them into the tool. Also, translations are playing a key role in part of the delivery process. So you need to have automated or at least semi-automated processes to support the translations so that you can reduce the time you spend on rolling out to different regions and countries. You need to submit to ethics, so having capabilities to do automatic submission packages will speed up the delivery. And then overall, having a collaboration, editing capabilities and review capabilities will make it smoother to process the consent forms together with your teams, or even if you're outsourcing the work. So independent whether you're developing the consent yourself or whether you're outsourcing, these things will actually make the delivery faster, make you able to scale up faster, and also save investment. So as a summary, you need support for both simple and complex ICFs. So that's the service level options. You need to be able to support flexibly different study types, different therapeutic areas. You should be able to flexibly resource your eConsent, so whether it's self-service or full service. And then in the end, you need those functionalities that smooth on the development of the ICFs. So with those words, I'm passing over to Ryan to talk about the regulatory topics.
Yeah, great, Mika, thank you. And just one question just before we get into Ryan that just sort of came through was, you know, when you mentioned that sort of simpler signature-based process, what does that actually look like? So you know, can you just explain that a little bit more, just a couple of minutes perhaps?
Yeah, sure. So I guess well, people typically understand eConsent as being an interactive multimedia approach where you have maybe video, you know, polling questions like we have here, or not maybe polling, but knowledge check questions and things like that. The more simpler approach is really taking your existing paper form in PDF format, capturing that in electronic system, and then showing that basically as it is to the patient, like they would be reading the paper. Now they can read it at home, and then executing the electronic signatures, you know, either signing on the screen, signing on the using username and password, or, well, if needed, then printing it out and signing on paper. So that's kind of simply what the simple solution is about.
Got it. So a little bit like perhaps how we might use DocuSign, you know, in our business.
Yeah, you can say that. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. Thanks, Mika. And yeah, so sorry to interrupt, and let's hand over to Ryan. I know you're going to talk to us about the regulatory landscape and how to navigate that as we try to scale up the eConsent. So over to you, Ryan.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Can everyone see my screen?
Yep, looks good on my end, Ryan.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so my name is Ryan Bowe. I'm head of regulatory compliance at Signet Health. And I just want to step in and just talk about the regulatory considerations of eConsent, scaling up eConsent, and how to navigate some of the pitfalls that we've seen through the experience of using it. So I just wanted to start off and just touch on, you know, what I think is the most important part when you're talking about eConsent, which is electronic records and electronic signatures. The major three that come to mind are 21 CFR Part 11 in the United States under the Food and Drugs Act, usual Annex 11 in the European Union, and also the PMDA in Japan, their electronic record and electronic signature guidelines. Other things to be considered when you're navigating the regulatory environment of eConsent regulations are the consent regulations. And I just tried to, this is not an exhaustive list, but I just tried to identify a few from the major regulatory authorities throughout the world. So what we spoke about before, Part 11, 21 CFR Part 50, which is consent, ICH GCP, which was touched on by Edwin a little bit, Revision 2, and eventually Revision 3 when it comes out in the next couple of months. We also have the clinical trials regulation in the European Union, some similar to medicines for human use in the UK. And also one that's generally forgotten but very important is the EIDAS regulation in the European Union, which dictates trust services and electronic signatures from the trust services. Actually, very surprisingly, there's very few guidance documents out on eConsent. From my knowledge, I'm only aware of 3 separate countries that actually provide guidance on eConsent. That would be, you know, the FDA, the MHRA has their joint statement, and also guidance in Belgium for these eConsent guidance. Is a very small list, and you would expect to see more out there than what is currently available for these guidance documents, how to deal with eConsent. So considerations for regulatory approval, a lot of the pitfalls that we run into at Signet Health, or just based in my experience, whether it's through an expert group or whatever, these 4 things are ones that really stand out to me. It's privacy laws and regulations have made it really tough to ensure to have approval for eConsent. Protection of patient privacy or data subject privacy is obviously hugely important factor, but it also does make it a little bit tougher to get these regulations or get eConsent into some of the countries that don't have guidance documents out on it. The nuances in local requirements. I can tell you, living in the United States, not only do we have to worry about FDA regulations, but also statewide regulations for signatures and consent and legal documents, which could easily be forgotten about when you're just considering the FDA by itself and not what state you're working in. Other countries such as Germany, you have 16 different data protection authorities that you need to be aware of for each local jurisdiction. You also have data localization laws. Reliability of results is also another thing that kind of slows the expansion of eConsent, just because the comparative studies that are out there aren't as robust as some from earlier adoptions of electronic systems such as ECOA, IRT systems, EDC systems. And one that's not really a regulatory consideration, but for me it's very important, end user experience. So just wanted to touch on privacy laws and regulations very quickly. The golden standard for privacy regulations is the GDPR in the European Union, and which spawned from that is the MR001 in France, Data Protection Act in Germany, Data Protection Act 2018 in the UK. All iterations of the GDPR, but they have their minute differences that need to be considered. In the United States, we have HIPAA to watch out for. CCPA has came into effect in 2020, which is similar to the GDPR, but just for the state of California. And two other ones that really stand out to me are data privacy laws in Russia and also in China. And those ones are came with the introduction of data localization laws, which is something that needs to be navigated as well. So just to touch on the local requirements, considerations are font size that within the system that you're using. 14-point font size is used in the United States in certain places. So having the customizable options to be able to have different font sizes depending on where it's being provisioned to in the world is very important. Considerations for the reading level of the ICF. It's no different than it would normally be for a paper ICF, but also needs to be considered, especially when you're doing multi-centered clinical trials, ensuring that you're hitting the right reading level for the participants in the countries that they reside. In some eConsent forms, you need to also have the customability. Some eConsents or some consent forms require patient home address, some don't. The home address is looked at as sensitive personal data in the European Union, and with data minimization as a key concept of the GDPR. Having a reason to collect the patient's home address is absolutely required, and in some countries they don't want you to collect that. One that also comes to mind is France through the MR001. One of their major clauses is ensuring that identifying information is not collected in the same system as health data. So make sure you're using a alphanumeric code such as a clinical research participant ID to identify the patient. Is something to be considered there. Also, the use of a legally authorized representative. I've seen some solutions that come out that don't even consider an LAR, which is something that's needed in certain situations where where the patient is under 14 years of age, under 16 years of age in certain countries, stuff like that. And then also, which Mika touched on a little bit, was the signature type. Some countries will allow a signature where it's only a digitalized signature. Some will require an electronic signature. And what kind of signature type that you're using needs to be able to be configured based on where you're deploying the eConsent solution. Another concept that comes up is the reliability of results. Sometimes the adoption is a little bit slower because comparative to paper, we know what to expect for paper informed consent forms, but when you come to electronic informed consent forms, we don't have those studies and that data that show the reliability of results. So when you're looking to navigate a regulatory authority in a country where an eConsent system is not used as much, you want to really think about the reliability of results and how you can show the reliability of results. Whether that's through validation requirements on a Part 11 and using a risk assessment to show why certain data is being collected that may not exactly be in line with privacy regulations such as the GDPR. Also using comparative statistical analysis on these eConsent systems as compared to paper, so running pilot studies. Comparative pilot studies is something that, having the results from that can also help having the results from the comparative statistical analysis, will help alleviate the concerns of the regulatory authority that the electronic system is comparative to the results, if not better, to a paper-based system. You want to think about end user surveys, discussing with the patients, discussing with the investigators, what they found easy to use about eConsent, which was some of the pitfalls, certain considerations like that. And then, like I said before, shadow studies or pilot studies, run them concurrently to ensure that the results are the same, if not better, between paper and electronic system. And the last part here, which, like I said, wasn't really regulatory consideration, but something that's really stood out to me as I've attended events and we've talked about using electronic consent in certain countries, is the end user experience. I know Mika touched on, the delivery choice model and what you're using, but things that sometimes aren't considered are the technical capabilities of the end user. Baseline expectations are that everybody can use technology, but the considerations for some of the patients are they'd rather use a paper-based. They don't understand the technology that they're using, and with that happening, you're going to have less reliable results because maybe the patient's afraid to ask questions for understanding or certain situations that may cause adverse effects to the patient, or and also for that user experience, consenting in person versus remote. I've heard experiences where patient's consenting window is anywhere between 12 p.m. and 4 p.m. Well, when you're in an office visit seeing somebody in person, you have a visit time specifically that that you'll be seen within that time. So when you're given a 4-hour window, you have to consider where the patient's going to be, where they're going to be around. So making sure that you have the options of the in-person, also the remote, to get the best results out of the patient and have the best understanding of the participant for what they're consenting to. So within that is also considerations of the participant's time and living situation. I mentioned the 4-hour windows for the time. It's going to kind of dissuade people to go to to consent remotely if a lot of their time is not being considered. Also their living situation. It's a private conversation between the patient and the investigator, and things to be considered are, do they have a room that they can go and have that private conversation? Does the patient or the participant feel comfortable discussing and asking questions in the environment that they're currently in? So, you want to have considerations, you want to have options that best fit the needs of the participant, the investigator, to make sure that you're really considering the patient's lifestyle and what's going on with them. And also investigator availability. And I put perceived here because, obviously investigators will be available to discuss to the patient, but does the patient feel that they're getting the most out of the investigator, their attention, making sure that they have the ability to ask the right questions for understanding. And some people might feel as though over a electronic system that they're not getting that same perceived availability in the investigator. So, with eConsent, just ensuring that you have the options available to make sure that the patient feels comfortable in what they're doing, give them the option for the correct technology, designing the eConsent to ensure that designing the processes that are used in terms of the eConsent to ensure that we're considering what the patient's doing and the patient's situation, basically. So for me, some of the major regulatory considerations to consider when you're looking to scale up with an eConsent of not just one product fits all, but having an eConsent that's highly customizable, highly configurable to fit the needs of everybody that's involved in the process of the clinical trial or the informed consent process. And for having an eConsent system using multimedia technology, and we feel eConsent can give better results, can really tick all these boxes if these things are taken into consideration and it's provisioned correctly.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. That was really helpful. And I think just very briefly, we've got a few questions coming. I just want to ask you one, but if you give a really brief answer to it before we move on to Edwin. It's about, you touched on that personal information protection law in China. And so what's the requirement around data storage when it comes to eConsent in China?
Right. So with China, like I said, you have the introduction of data localization laws. And what happens there is, in order to efficiently or effectively work in China, considerations of where your server is located, where the data is stored. The ideal position would be to have the servers stored within the borders of China. There are considerations for allowing you to transfer that data outside of China, as long as there is a primary copy kept within the borders of China. Making sure that you have a representative within China, especially when you're thinking of HGRAC regulations and genetic and things with genetic data, just ensuring that you have a representative within country that can support you, and also, like I said, make sure that there is a copy of the data within the country before a copy is transferred outside of the country.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ryan. Really helpful. So, Edwin, back to you. I know you're going to tell us a little bit about how you're planning to roll out eConsent within AstraZeneca.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Just to check, how much time do we have left?
13 minutes.
13 minutes, okay. Because I've got 2 slides, you know. So, question here before I share some learnings and considerations is, how does the future of the ICF look like, and how do we envision this to work in the future, and what does it need to do in the future? So first of all, we need to make a shift from paper towards fully digital. We want to move from wet ink signatures to electronic signatures. And with electronic signatures, we can differentiate between stylus, username, password, or even biometrical signatures, and then eventually to go to decentralized trials. We definitely want to move from on-site consenting to remote consenting, and this will not only help to perform and start doing fully remote and decentralized trials, but also already in the here and now, that it will help support the reconsenting process. And ideally, all of this is being implemented in all our studies, all our countries that we operate in, that all sites that we have selected are supportive of using this. And probably most important, that all our patients that we include in our clinical trials are comfortable and really value the change that we've made when using eConsent. But there are a couple of things that we consider that eConsent needs to have as part of a solution, and where I close with all patients need to be able to review this. I would like to start by saying here that in our belief, eConsent needs to empower all the patients while making a truly informed decision so that it maximizes their clinical trial experience. So we want to be sure that they fully understand what they are signing up for, that they are comfortable in such a way that they don't drop out quickly after they've been randomized, because the actual study doesn't meet their expectations, and that it gives them the confidence to continue not only for short studies, but also our long endpoint trials that we have. In addition to this, the solution needs to enable site staff to focus on more individual and tailored patients discussions. With the document now being able to have it digital, we can monitor the entire process. If you enable certain functionalities like questions and answers, highlighting sections, for example, or free text fields, for example, in an ICF, then we have it captured, and then the site staff can really tailor and focus on the key concerns that the patient may have, address these, and have a proper conversation with the patient, with family, friends, whoever needs and would like to be involved in the consenting process. Also, one of the perceived benefits of eConsent is that it will reduce the administrative burden from a filing perspective, and eventually, if you have done and implemented full-scale an eConsent solution, it will reduce the administrative burden when updating ICFs and creating amendments. And as an end result of that, we will definitely have less audit findings. Many of the audit findings currently are seen in backdating consent forms, having people sign a consent form who are not delegated, and with that all being captured properly and maintained in a system, we will definitely be able to remove that. And by far, one of the most things that we can do with a digital solution then in place is that it allows us to make continuous improvement to the document, to the system, and to the process. So we can help and support the consenting process on site much better. We can see where patients drop in the consenting process. We can measure much better the relationship between the content and the dropout rate. And definitely we can sort of improve the content itself, so being more in lay language, and we can improve the supportive content that we are going to utilize in this digital solution, like illustrations and animations that we're developing. And then if I move to the next slide, and this is my final slide, I would like to share with you some learnings and considerations. And I would like to start with that it helps if your organization has a clear vision and a strategy and a belief that digital health in research and development is going to be one of the key areas to focus on. And if you have that, then it helps to align your eConsent vision that I really recommend you to develop, to align that with your company strategy and vision. And in addition to that, you need to have a clear implementation strategy. Where do you start? Do you start with testing, piloting, doing this in silo, or are you going to do some research before you start exploring this in a couple of studies? And you need to have a clear idea when it's the right time to scale. You need to ensure that the benefits for eConsent are going to be clear for all the individual stakeholders that are involved in the informed consent process and how they will benefit from this. This is, as mentioned in my first slide, internal, very relevant, but also externally. So we need to support site staff in explaining why we think it's adding value for patients. We have tons of research out there already that shows that patients benefit supportive illustrations, animation, but also reading it on in a digital form is being perceived much better than pure paper. So we need to use this evidence and to explain this to our stakeholders to get it properly implemented. With that, we need to explain to everyone how the current ICF process is being done and understand and explain to them what eConsent is. Still, I see that there is a misunderstanding of what eConsent really is and what it can do. So purely digitalizing the document and adding an electronic signature is what I consider to be just one of the components of eConsent. But by adding questions and answers, having the ability to remotely review, remotely sign it with supportive telehealth functionalities, for example, that really comes close to a more holistic view of eConsent, and definitely it will include supportive illustrations and animations. So if you consider to either start with eConsent, or if you're in the process of scaling it, then take the full end-to-end life cycle of the informed consent process into account and decide upon which parts of the process or the document you want to digitalize. Are you only going to digitalize the document, the final documents in local language, for example? Or are you going to digitalize the entire development of the document? And if you have been looking into digitalizing the components, are you then able to automate that process, automate the development, and then standardize things so you can reuse similar type of information across your different studies, across the different programs, and across the different studies that you use. Also very important, and this is probably one of the key things, you need to very carefully look at if you have the right people and the right processes in place that allow you to scale this solution. And also, as part of that, you need to identify how they are currently and how your current organization is impacted by this change, by this implementation of a digital solution. And it could be that your organization is already set up to seamlessly bring in a digital solution and bring it at scale, bring it to scale, or maybe it requires you to train your people differently and to rearrange your processes to align with the digital solution. And one of these sort of misunderstandings that is seen and heard a lot, that I really want to call out, is that the digital solution, like an eConsent, is just the enabler of the current consenting process on site. And still, and this comes again with the misunderstanding, people think that if you implement eConsent, that the documents will not be that lengthy anymore. They will not be technical anymore. And it's very easy to read and understand by all our patients. But purely by introducing a digital solution, that's not going to be the case. So you can think about implementing a digital solution, but if you don't properly think about the consent form itself, how it's been developed, you will most likely not get the end result that you were looking for. And then the final thing that I want to close with is that I think it's still fair to acknowledge that eConsent is still immature when it comes to acceptance by us as an industry, but also when it comes to regulatory authorities, site staff, and supports. And that we are pretty immature when it comes to the implementation. And I think the poll already showed that no one has this at scale, and the complexity of the process is sort of part of the reason that's causing this. But I think, and definitely where I want to close with, is that we need to recognize and acknowledge that we are, with the introduction of eConsent, are adding true value for our patients and maximize that patient experience. And we need, and to get there, to get to the state where we have all patients consent by an eConsent, that's a long way to go. And we need to do this together with all the different stakeholders we have within this process. But also, I would say, we need to do this collaboratively within the industry. And most importantly, we need to do this collaboratively with the patients that we recruit. So today, with the implementation of eConsent, we are already making that difference. And yes, we are already adding value for our patients. So let me stop there.
Oh, thank you, Edwin. And really great. And I love your points at the end there about the need to collaborate, particularly across the industry as well. I got a very interesting question that I thought maybe I could ask you, Edwin, if you don't mind. And I'm sure you've thought about this. How does the withdrawal of consent process work in the scenario where perhaps we're using an electronic tool to consent? How would you see that working?
So currently also there's a lot of misunderstanding around withdrawal of the informed consent itself versus the withdrawal of options that can be chosen within a study, for example, like optional biopsies or optional procedures. And with paper, that's really difficult to track. When it becomes digital, we are much better to manage that and to keep oversight on the different options that they can sort of either withdraw from or stop continuing to do within the study. And definitely, if we have it all captured in electronically, we can be much more quicker and flexible in following up once that decision has been made. currently there's time between the patient making that decision and that information coming through to the site staff, to us as sponsors. And yeah, that's definitely something where this can add value.
Yeah, thanks, Edwin. And maybe just invite the other panelists back on if you want us to turn your videos on, perhaps. You know, a couple more questions that have come in that, again, I think are really interesting. And one is about integration, and maybe talk a little bit more about experience of integrating with EDC, such as Rave, or maybe much more generally. What do you think, perhaps Edwin, from an AZ perspective, what do you think the important other e-clinical systems are that need to be integrated with eConsent? Where do you see the value there?
Well, I think from a purely sponsor perspective and the benefits for eConsent, having it digital, it definitely is going to add value when we integrate as much as possible. So removing any duplication of information is going to be adding value. It's going to save us time. It's going to save a lot of discrepancies that exist if you sort of need to duplicate the information. And as I said, if you have the proper infrastructure in place and the architecture behind it, then like a consenting, so you can do it seamlessly, like when a patient has consented, then it automatically would generate a patient code that triggers the IMP release, for example, and withdrawal would automatically stop the release of IMP. So in the ideal world, that needs to be the case, and I truly believe that that is possible.
Yeah, that's great, and thank you, Edwin. We've had quite a few questions. We will get to these after the event, but I just wanted to ask perhaps one final question, and maybe this is both to Mika and Edwin, which is, how difficult is it to run a hybrid of paper and eConsent to take into account different patient populations, is what the audience member has asked.
Well, maybe if I go first. So yeah, that's a good question, because we are stuck with paper, even if we don't like it. But we have countries where signing on paper is, for example, mandatory, and that's why it's kind of been always given a thought how to handle that as part of the eConsent. So it's possible to configure the eConsent system so that it actually forces you to kind of not sign on electronically, but rather print out the document, which you can do from the system, then capture the signature on paper, and then the site can scan and upload it back to the system for closing the loop and keeping the records in one place. And of course, all of the kind of following the enrollment statistics and things like that will then be kind of updated accordingly. Edwin, any yeah.
Yeah, I think several systems will be able to sort of accommodate the hybrid model. I would say it's probably not ideal from an operational perspective and a monitoring perspective if you need to sort of train people, site staff, and sort of monitor, like, this is paper, this is electronic. So ideally everything is digital. I understand that even per study, per country, and per site is going to be challenging, sometimes purely due to the regulations. But I think it's just something that we need to accept. And I think the better we are capable of explaining and showing that it's adding value for patients and that it can be done, the development in the timelines that are sort of not putting your first subject in at risk, for example, that people will become more comfortable with an eConsent. And I always compare this, and I think that was one of my quotes as well, is that if we look at eConsent similar to eCOA, we didn't have a hybrid. Well, maybe at the beginning we had a hybrid model as well, but now eCOA, I can't imagine a study with having it purely on paper anymore. So it's a given that electronic is being used. And I definitely would like to get to a state where eConsent is seen as the same. But yeah, I think it's fair to say that it will take us, it will be a journey for sure.
And that's a great place to finish, actually. So thank you, Edwin. And I'd like to just thank all the panelists and the audience for joining us today, and really appreciate it. Back to you, Edward.
Yes, of course. And thank you to all of our panelists here for those answers. It's very much appreciated. So we have, as Bill mentioned, reached the end of the question and answer portion for today's webinar. If we couldn't attend to your questions today, the team at Signant Health will follow up with you after the webinar. But if you do have further questions, please also direct them to the email address showing on your screen. That's hello@signanthealth.com. Again, thank you everyone for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from Xtalks with access to the recorded archive for this event. And I've also sent you all a link in your chat. You're welcome to share this link and the recording with other members of your team or colleagues. We do very much appreciate it when you do. And a survey window will be popping up on your screen, and your participation is appreciated on that, as it will help Xtalks to improve their webinars. Again, just a final thank you to all our speakers. Everyone, thank you so much for an amazing presentation today. Alrighty, we hope you found this webinar informative, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.